Hey everyone, welcome to the Ask an Architect show. Here we are at the ACSA Administrators Conference for a special Academy edition of the show. With me today is Barton from Stanford. John, thanks for joining us. John, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're up to right now?
I'm the director of the architectural design program at Stanford University. It's a small, unaccredited four-year program, and we graduate about 10 or 15 students a year, but we have about 60 students in the program total.
Fantastic. And John, we've known each other for a little bit here, and I really want to take a full circle approach to this interview. I want to talk a little bit about your background as an architect and a practitioner from early on to now, as well as your experience in the academy and what your strategy is at Stanford. So first, let's start with your early career. When you first came out of school and you were practicing, what kind of things were you seeing, learning, doing that really started to inform and affect the future parts of your career?
When I first got out of school and started working, I think I realized there was a big difference between school and work, and that work wasn't always as satisfying as school was, and that to some extent even what we were taught in school was different than what we were doing in practice. And we've tried to understand that relationship at Stanford a lot, in terms of being clear with students what the profession is like, but also trying to train students to become leaders in the profession, to make the profession more family-friendly, more healthy, more equitable, and more malleable to the kinds of changes that it needs to have.
John, how long in your career did it take before you kind of transitioned over to academia? Was that instant as soon as you graduated? Did you stay in the academy, or did you kind of isolate yourself and practice for a little bit and then come back to the academy? What was your path?
So when I graduated from Cal in 1983, I worked for about 3 years and then went back to graduate school and started teaching as a teaching assistant as a graduate student. And then worked after graduate school for must have been about 2 years before I came back to Cal as a lecturer.
So pretty quick.
So pretty quickly. And I would say that there have been two glides, one up and one down. That at first I was doing more practice and less teaching, and now I'm doing much more teaching and less practice.
Interesting. So how has your career in the academy evolved? What kind of things were you working on research-wise at the start of your career, and how did that then transition to what you might be working on now? Kind of give us that whole timeline of your work in the academy.
So I started out as a lecturer. I've had an unusual path in academia for somebody who's been teaching for over 25 years. I've never had a tenure track position. I've always been a lecturer, broadly defined. And so my task is to teach. And so my interest has always been in teaching and methods of teaching and how to reach students. And the reality is that students are different today than they were 25 years ago. It's not good, bad, or indifferent. It's just a fact. They bring different strengths and different weaknesses to the classroom. And my goal is to always be able to meet them where they are and find ways to empower them and make what we do interesting and relevant.
So you mentioned your focus on teaching versus, I guess, as opposed to research or a specific niche topic. So how would you define a good teacher today? Like, what defines good teaching? What makes good teaching, in your opinion?
I think, first of all, the teacher needs to be authentic. They need to be who they are, and they need to bring compassion, and they need to bring understanding, and they need to bring a philosophy to the classroom that they're willing to share. They also need to be vulnerable. I think students today are much less risk tolerant than maybe 25 or 30 years ago.
Do you think that's a result of the economy in '08 and seeing people not have jobs and seeing people not be as secure in their careers? Or what do you think that is? What's the reason for that?
As a former school board member, I could go down a long road on this conversation, but I think it has to do with a testing mentality in school. I think a checkbox mentality in high schools. I see this in our Stanford students who come to Stanford, who've done all the right things, but risk-taking is not one of them. And so we need to teach risk-taking, and that takes compassion.
John, one of the things we try to do in the show is highlight all the different career options available for folks with an architecture degree, and especially for those folks who are architects, even where they can kind of branch out. So teaching is obviously one of those areas, and it's an area that many of our students already know that they want to kind of focus on. What types of advice or pieces of advice would you give to a student who's in school right now but interested in eventually growing into a full-time faculty member one day?
Well, I think, first of all, they need to go to graduate school. The Stanford program is only an undergraduate program for now, so they need to go to graduate school. Then they need to think about that graduate school level, whether it's a master's degree or PhD, depending on their topics. So we talk to the students about, if they're more interested in history and theory, perhaps a PhD is more appropriate. If they're interested in more traditional areas of practice and design, probably a master's degree. And then to become a TA and learn how to teach early on, and look at models of teaching that have been valuable to them and start to understand why they were valuable to them and why they might not be valuable to somebody else, and begin to develop a core set of methodologies that can appeal to and reach out to a broad range of students.
Interesting. How you mentioned a little bit ago that students are obviously very different 20 years ago from the way they are now, and that evolution will surely continue as technology changes and society changes. But what are some of the how would you define today's generation of students? What are you seeing? It's hard to categorize an entire class or generation, but just trends in the classroom. What are you seeing overall? You mentioned being risk averse. Are there any other features that people should be self-aware about and realize that it's kind of a trend for this generation?
I think current students are very questioning. They're very questioning of their environment, and I don't mean that in the physical sense. I mean that in the environment.
Curious.
They're curious, but they're also questioning. They're questioning what it means to be a citizen in the world, and I'm using citizen in a broad sense of the word. I think they're questioning what it means to be successful and happy in the world, and these are good things to do. They're inquisitive, they're questioning, they're engaged in the classroom, they are stressed in many cases around all of these decisions, but I think that the combination of their inquisitiveness and their malleableness, and I mean that in a positive sense, bodes well for our future.
I want to piggyback on some of those comments in regard to Stanford specifically. I know we've talked a little bit before about the unique approach you're trying to instill in Stanford in terms of the studio culture, in terms of the strategy of teaching. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts about how you see the Stanford environment today and how you'd like to try to evolve it, or what your long-term goals are in terms of the Stanford program?
So we're beginning to explore a teaching methodology that dispenses with desk crits and final reviews and relies mostly on student conversation. We think that leverages all that inquisitiveness and that engagement that we were talking about, and leverages their ability to question their place in the world and begin to define their place in the world. We also are really questioning of the profession's reliance on all-nighters and definition of becoming an architect is once you've bled on your model, and we think that those approaches to learning are inappropriate and counterproductive and not healthy in the long run, and that if we're going to make changes in the profession and make more family-friendly workplaces and more healthy workplaces, we need to start in the classroom. We recognize that that puts up a potential barrier down the road. So one of the things that we do is we reach out to firms and we start talking to them about our strategy and how do our values match up to their values, and we can begin to channel students into firms where we think they'll be more happy. And we look at the same thing in graduate schools. And we prepare the students for the fact that Stanford's program, its community collaborative approach, is not the same as many other places, and that they need to bear the strengths and weaknesses associated with that difference when they go to graduate school or when they go into the profession, but we prepare them for that reality.
John, it's really refreshing to hear some of those comments. Clearly Stanford is a very high-level, academic-oriented school, but you're talking about very practical things. You're talking about work-life balance. You're talking about looking at studio culture and revamping it to be more comfortable and more welcoming to the student. You talked earlier about your teaching style and being vulnerable to the student and being accommodating to the student and really trying to be the best teacher you could be, not necessarily a researcher or an expert on a topic, but a better teacher. And that's all fascinating coming from Stanford, where you're at the forefront of academic progress. And so to see you really focus on the profession and the person is really refreshing. I think a lot of people will respond to that. So John, just to kind of finish up, you already talked a lot about Stanford and the reasons to come, but is there any other promotion or any other reason? We have a lot of folks out there who are looking at undergrad. We have high school students, even some folks who may want to come for grad school for other topics at Stanford. Why should people come to Stanford? What's so great? Obviously great reputation, but what else is there? What do they not know that they should know about Stanford?
Stanford's at the hub of innovation. It's the engine of Silicon Valley, and it's the result of the engine of Silicon Valley. And so it is a place where anything is possible. I say this as a wonderful alumni of the University of California, Berkeley. But Stanford is a truly amazing place. You can do anything. The people next door to you will be the best in the world at something they do. The people down the street will be the first in their family to go to college, but also one of the best at something in the world. It's a diverse place in every measure of the word. It's a place that welcomes and honors and cherishes people being different and exploring those differences.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, John. I think there are a lot of reasons to check out Stanford. If you're interested in going to school there, Natalie, if we could put the link up here on the screen, and please check them out and give it a look. John, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I think there's a lot of value here for folks out there watching, and I hope to see you again soon. So thanks, John. And that's all. We'll see you next time on the Ask an Architect Show.